So, welcome to the third session of Fundamentals of Designing, Monitoring, and Evaluating for Results at GNI. This session number 3 is about designing for results, part 1. At the end of this session, we hope that participants will be able to list the key steps in the project design process following the assessment, identify the components of a results chain, identify the columns and rows of GNI's log frame, distinguish the difference between outcome and output statements, understand the purpose for identifying assumptions, clarify differences among key measurement terms, and develop strong indicators to measure objective statements. So that's a lot of expectations. Okay, so here we are in our project cycle. We've completed our assessment, and now we have a much clearer idea of the project site context. So now we need to use what we learned through the analysis and design a relevant project. So again, we're using the results of our analysis, and we're going to first refine and formulate project objectives and intended results. Then we're going to identify external factors that could interfere with the achievement of results. Next, we need to determine how we will measure our identified results using strong indicators. And after having completed all of these steps, then we can conduct a baseline study to collect the current data on our specified indicators. So these will then be used later on to compare with the results at the end of the project. So while the logical framework is the key tool for these important steps of project design, then the M&E plan is the key tool for our baseline study. Okay, so together with stakeholders, you identified the main problems and opportunities for improvement in the project site, and you narrowed the scope into a set of objectives for which your project will focus. The next stage involves clarifying the objectives through precise and measurable statements and identifying strategies to meet those objectives. While you use stakeholder involvement to develop the problem and objective trees, at this point it's helpful to have a much smaller team, project managers, sector specialists, M&E specialists, and take the results from the objective tree and analyze and refine into a results chain. So knowing that we want to design for results and not just activities, we will develop a results chain to help us clarify what we need to do in order to achieve those desired changes. So if you can see in this image, we can't expect a miracle to happen and make the results on their own. We need to actually logically think through each step and how to bring about the changes. So the results chain will help us do this. The key components of the results chain are inputs, which are the financial, human, and material resources that we're going to use to undertake our activities. The activities are undertaken to transform inputs into outputs, and the outputs are direct products and services or the deliverables from the activities. Then the outcomes are our desired change as a result of the outputs. And the goal is the long-term ultimate purpose of the project. So we'll discuss in detail how to develop each component of these results chain in the session. So here again is the simple example that we walked through earlier of the vaccination campaign. Now you can see how the statements, the activity, output, outcome, and goal, how they compromise the results chain. So the results chain helps us to clarify the basic strategy underlying our project, and it communicates what our project is about and what it's not about. Now, as we saw in the vaccination example, the results chain shows a simple and clear understanding of the relationships from the project activities to the goal of our project. But because we're managing for results, we also need to plan and specify how we'll know whether we've achieved the results at each level of the chain or not. So to do this, the results framework will be developed. So the results chain turns into the results framework here. The results framework is a matrix containing a listing of the results the project is aiming to achieve, which is the results chain that we just talked about, and the indicators to measure the results. It also includes assumptions and risks that could affect the achievement of results. So the results framework helps define the relationships among factors key to the implementation and success of a project, both internal and external to the program context. It serves as the foundation for M&E, and it's a crucial tool for both planning and management. So there's a lot of different types and terms and shapes for results frameworks with different organizations. The one that GNI requires is called the logical framework. So log frames are intended to communicate the project logic, to assist in project design by identifying the connections and relationships between resources, activities, and results. Log frames are intended to ensure that monitoring of key elements in the results chain is addressed during project planning. They're used to help identify and assess risks and assumptions inherent in the proposed project design, and to serve as a framework for evaluation of the project. So you can see the basic structure of GNI's log frame here. It's a simplified format that's composed of 4 rows and 4 columns. So the rows depict a summary of the results chain, which we just went through. So this should look familiar, as we just discussed. And for consistency within the organization, when we're talking about our log frame and our results chain, we're using these terms: goal, outcome, outputs, activities. Then, going across, the columns incorporate a set of assumptions behind each link in the chain, as well as indicators to measure the achievement of each step in the chain. So this tool, this log frame, is the core of monitoring and evaluation. Now, developing realistic and logical results between the levels is critical to success in moving up that chain. So each relationship can be described with if-then statements, as we see here. So if adequate resources are provided, then the activities can be conducted. If the activities are conducted, then the outputs can be produced. If the outputs are produced, then the outcomes will occur. And if the outcomes occur, then this will contribute towards the overall goal. So while project implementation takes place from bottom to top, so starting with activities, the designing actually should take place from top to bottom. So we'll discuss how to do that now. So as we've been discussing, we want to shift our focus when it comes to project design, and we want to focus on designing for results. To do this, we need to take a goal-oriented approach to project design. So most of us tend to specify our projects in terms of the activities that are being conducted. We think about the work we do on a daily basis. So the activities that we're conducting. However, we're obviously not doing these activities for their own sake. So when we're designing the project, we should first ask, why do we want to do this? What's our goal? And then we can move on to decide how will we address this problem? How can we reach that goal? So this will force us to think critically about our intended results and the steps needed to achieve them. So for goal-oriented project design, we start with that goal. A goal statement is a simple, clear statement of the long-term impact we want to bring about through our project or the end result of our project. Goals are not always quantifiable or measurable, and they may not be something that G and I can do alone. The goal should identify the broader purpose for the project. So it will answer the question, what is the community like if we're successful? Then, after we've defined our goal, the remainder of the results chain development involves identifying how we will work towards that goal. Thus, we next need to answer what changes need to take place in order to reach our goal. These changes are the outcomes. So outcomes are what the project expects to accomplish at the beneficiary level that will contribute towards our goal. They're medium and long-term changes in conditions. Unlike the goals, which don't necessarily need to be measured, outcomes do need to be measurable. And the outcomes often relate to changes in conditions, behavior, or knowledge among individuals, groups, systems, or organizations. So some example outcome statements might be reduction in the level of domestic violence, improved access of poor to financial services, enhanced practice of hand hygiene among school children. Then, following the development of our key project outcomes, the set of deliverables needed to achieve those outcomes needs to be determined. So these are the outputs. Outputs are the direct deliverables resulting from project activities that aggregate and contribute towards achievement of outcomes. These are generally products, goods, and services, and they should be attainable and within the direct control of the project team. So outputs and outcomes are often confused. Outputs are what we actually do as a project. And the outcomes, on the other hand, are the changes that we want to see occurring. They're the effect that we want to see. So outputs are measured at the project level, and outcomes are usually measured at the population level. So that also helps define the difference in the two. So some examples of output statements: healthcare workers trained on specific skills, roads built, BCC materials developed, advocacy campaign conducted. So you can see the difference between output statements and outcome statements there. Now, at the lowest level of the log frame, we have our project activities. So activities are actions taken through which inputs are mobilized to produce the outputs. So project staff is directly accountable for our activities, and each activity should lead directly to an output. So if you're reviewing your log frame and you find an activity in there that's not related to an output, you should get rid of it. There's no point in having it there if it's not going to lead towards our outcome. And each output should have one or more activity. And you want to focus on major activities in the log frame. So you'll have other documents where you can define sub-activities, but your log frame, you want to focus on the major activities. Now, don't let the activities lead the log frame. So we need to focus on the goal what we want to accomplish before we think about the activities. Examples of activities, which do sound similar to the outputs, could be develop training curriculum, recruit training team, and conduct training. So these are all example activities. So now we've discussed each level of the results chain. So let's look at an example of how they fit together. So inputs. If facilities, trainers, and materials are provided, then activities. The literacy training courses are conducted. If literacy training courses are conducted, then we see outputs. Adults complete the literacy courses. As we move up logically, if adults complete the literacy courses, then we'll see a change. We'll see increased literacy skills and more employment opportunities. These are our outcomes. And finally, if we have increased literacy skills and more employment opportunities, then we will see a higher income level and increased access to higher skilled jobs. That's our goal. So we've completed the vertical logic from inputs, activities, outputs, to outcomes, to goal. But this only works in a perfect world where no other factors can affect the achievement of one level from the next. But in reality, the project alone cannot guarantee that objectives are going to be achieved. So external factors will begin to affect the project as soon as implementation begins, and these external factors need to be identified beforehand. So these external factors that could interfere with the project's logical results are called assumptions. Assumptions are often outside the control of the project team, and they often rely on a sound understanding of the local context in order to identify them. So assumptions complete that if-then logic that we were talking about before by adding and in between. So let me show you what this looks like. So when you're designing your assumptions, you're filling out this column of the log frame, you want to go through the logic of your log frame. So you'll say, if activities, I apologize for my art skills, and assumptions at that level, then that will lead to the outputs. And if the outputs are produced and the assumptions hold true at that level of the log frame, then we'll be able to see changes or our outcomes. And if the outcomes occur and the assumptions hold true at that level of the log frame, then ultimately we'll be able to contribute towards the goal. So that is how we want to walk through our logic of our log frame. And testing the robustness of the intervention logic in this way should take place prior to moving on to indicator development. Okay, so when we're formulating assumptions, it's often helpful to first think of them in terms of risks. So a risk is a negative statement of what might prevent the objectives from being achieved. So for example, farmers may not be willing to try out new varieties of rice. This is a risk that could affect the success of our project. Then an assumption, on the other hand, is a positive statement of a condition that must be met in order for the project objectives to be achieved. So opposite of the risk, the assumption would be that farmers are willing to try out new varieties of rice. So in order for our project to be successful, we're assuming that farmers are willing to try new varieties of rice. So the purpose of the risks and the assumptions are the same. They're to assess and address external impacts on the project and improve, where possible, the robustness of the design. Here's some more example assumptions. So at the higher levels of the log frame, maybe the outcome level, you might have assumptions such as supportive infrastructure is in place, government policy remains favorable, and here are some lower level examples. You're assuming that construction materials are available in the local market. You're assuming that local distribution systems perform as expected. We might assume that funds are released on time, that local institutions collaborate as planned, and that suitable staff are identified and recruited and remain there to work. So we want to pay particular attention to the assumptions between the outputs and the outcomes, because these are the most critical to success of a project. So in order to identify assumptions and determine which to include in the log frame, the team will need to follow a process similar to this. First, you want to identify the potential risks. So if you do these activities, what might stop you from delivering the outputs? And then go on up the chain. If you're successful in delivering the outputs, what could stop you from achieving the outcomes? If the outcomes are achieved, what could stop you in it contributing towards the goal? So you want to identify the potential risks and then analyze those risks. So assess the probability, what's the probability of this happening? And if it happens, what kind of impact would it have? Then you want to determine what to do with those assumptions or those risks. So determine if you need to redesign the project because the risk and the impact are too high, or if you include the risk as an assumption in the log frame, and if you do that, you need to continue to monitor that assumption. Or do you adjust the project design to minimize the risk? So let's look at an example of when this can happen. So let's say that our outcome, we want to see an improved rate. We want to see improved science skills among target children. That's our outcome. So we think that if we provide science lab equipment to these schools, then we'll see the outcome, which is science skills among the target children are improved. So that's our output and our outcome, and you can see there's some gaps in between the output and outcome. So we want to ask ourselves, what are the gaps? What's missing in between here? Well, we're assuming that schools have space to store the equipment. And we're assuming that teachers know how to use the equipment. And we might be assuming that the equipment can be maintained properly. So without these in place, our achieving of the outcome is questionable. So what you want to do when you identify the risks that the project team actually can address, you want to actually take those assumptions and adjust your project design. So you take these and you turn them into activities. So now we're going to ensure that schools have room to store the equipment. We might add an activity that involves building a storage room. And we're going to add an activity in which we teach teachers how to use the equipment. And maybe we're going to train students how to maintain the equipment. So we're going to adjust our project design and improve the robustness of our project. Now, as we just saw, analyzing risks and assumptions can result in changes in the project outputs and activities. So that's why we complete the assumptions column prior to moving on to indicator development. Once we've identified and prioritized what it is that we'll measure along with our assumptions, then we can move on to determining how we'll measure it. And these are our indicators. So indicators are qualitative and quantitative measures that allow us to verify our project progress. Indicators are important because they indicate. They signal the need for corrective management action, and they provide evidence as to whether objectives were achieved or not. So good indicators are the key to successful results measurement. Now, each level of the log frame has different kind of indicators. First, we have goal indicators. As I mentioned, goals are not always necessarily measurable and not always completely within the control of the project team. So indicators here are not actually required. This doesn't mean you can't have goal indicators if your project chooses, but it's not required. Outcome indicators measure changes in status, practices, or behaviors resulting from the project outputs. Measuring outcome indicators is the evaluation component of the project, and it shows the ultimate effect of the project. So indicators at this level are most crucial. Then moving down, activity and output level indicators. They'll be measured by regular monitoring activities, and they allow project management to track what is being delivered and indicate what the project has actually done. So you've probably heard the term SMART indicators. Indicators should be SMART. What this stands for, the S, indicators should be specific. So you want to ask yourself, is the indicator specific enough to measure progress towards the results? M, indicators should be measurable. So the indicator must be quantifiable and measurable. So your team wants to ask, can the indicator be assessed objectively and independently? A, indicators should be achievable. So you want to be able to attain results within this indicator within the constraints of the project triangle. So budget, resources, time, scope, and quality. And R, indicators should be relevant. So is the indicator relevant to the intended outputs and outcomes? And T, time-bound. Are data available at reasonable cost and effort within the allocated time? So in addition to being SMART, there are other criteria that can help make for better, stronger indicators. And here are some additional recommended criteria. So indicators should be practical. Data should be available when it's needed at a reasonable cost. Indicators should be reliable, which means they should measure real change consistently over time and place and person. They should be simple, so everyone should be able to understand them easily. They should be direct. They should measure as close as possible to the objectives. And they should be direction neutral. So there's no need to say improved or reduced or strengthened within the indicator itself. Your data will tell you that. They are targetless. So there's no need to include the performance target in your indicator. And they should be disaggregated by gender or age or whatever else is relevant for your project when possible. So when you're drafting your indicators, if you think about the structure of the global standard indicators, such as WHO indicators, SDG indicators, that can help you think through the structure of your indicator and what makes a good indicator. And you can see some examples of those over here. Maternal mortality rate, primary completion rate, proportion of population living below the national poverty line, percentage of infants under 6 months who are exclusively breastfed. So these are some examples of standard global indicators that fit the criteria that we just went through. So also, when it comes to indicators, there's no need to reinvent the wheel, which means there's no need to redesign an indicator every time. So good standard indicators already exist out there in the development field, and using them will allow us to compare with others. So using standard indicators can save time in the design process, and it also provides the advantage of having accepted standard definitions to the indicators, which ensures they are measured reliably and consistently. In addition, measurement methods are usually well developed and field tested, and industry recognized indicators help contribute to credibility and legitimacy. So here are some categories of standard indicators that can be considered when you're selecting yours. GNI recommended standard indicators. The government might have their own set of indicators for their strategies. You can consider the Sustainable Development Goal indicators and other sector-specific global standard indicators. So we know that standard indicators won't always be relevant or possible for every single indicator. So the best is to use a combination of standard and customized indicators. Now the last piece of the log frame that we need to discuss is the means of verification column. Means of verification are the specific data sources from which the indicator data can be found. So MOVs should be practical, specific, and cost-effective, and build on existing information if possible. Further details on the MOVs should be developed later when you do your performance measurement plan, which we'll talk about in the next session. However, the identification of MOVs at this point is important because discussion on where to find the information and how to collect it can sometimes lead to the need to reformulate the indicators. Some examples of means of verification, or more simply sources, are here. Household surveys conducted at baseline and endline, participant registry of training, secondary data, distribution records completed by project staff. These are your sources or your means of verification. Now, when determining the proper source or means of verification to use, there's a lot of things to consider. There are several different types of data and advantages and disadvantages to each. So data are often categorized into primary and secondary data. Primary data is data that's been collected by you or your team, while secondary data is collected by others. So advantages of primary data lines up with our needs more specifically. So in terms of indicators and participants, we can also usually trust the reliability and accuracy of primary data since we know how it was collected and who collected it. Disadvantage to primary data: it usually costs more to collect data yourself than to simply review data that already exists. It also requires some technical expertise, and primary data collection usually takes more time. So some examples of primary data include the PAP, household surveys, observation, interviews, and participation logs. So this is data that your team has collected itself. Secondary data, some advantages are sort of the opposite of primary data. It's the disadvantages of primary data. So secondary data requires less time, lower cost, and the sample size is often large enough for generalization. Disadvantages can be, the most important disadvantage is that the data is not a perfect match for our needs. So in terms of target group and research question, the data was not collected for us or by us, so it's not going to necessarily line up with what we need. Secondary data is also often too old, and we don't know who collected it or how they collected it, so it's not necessarily trustworthy. So examples of secondary data can include census data, government health or education statistics, market data collected by other organizations, or maps. Data is also categorized into quantitative and qualitative data. So quantitative research gathers data in a numerical form, while qualitative research gathers information that is not in numerical form. So it's descriptive, it uses words. Quantitative data usually requires a large sample size, and the data is very specific and focused. While qualitative data usually has a much smaller sample, and the information is more general. As far as techniques, quantitative data comes from more structured methods like surveys, secondary statistics, while qualitative data comes from unstructured or semi-structured sources such as the PAP, interviews, observation. Quantitative focuses on what and how many, while qualitative data focuses on why and how. And finally, in terms of the outputs from each type of data, quantitative yields results in projectable numbers and statistical analysis, while qualitative gives results in description or summary. So when considering what data source to use for which indicator, the source also depends to some extent on the level of the log frame of that indicator. So sources of data for activity indicators often come from GNI financial and operational records, observation records, and meeting minutes. And data for output indicators can be found in GNI operational records, attendance reports, and records of products and services delivered. So these are part of monitoring. Then at the higher level, outcome indicator data usually comes from things like surveys, interviews, focus groups. And this higher level is part of evaluation. So as discussed, when choosing which source to use for data collection of each indicator, there are lots of factors to consider. For each indicator, you'll want to weigh the advantages and disadvantages of each to determine which source to actually use. It's also recommended that the team uses more than one type of data for the same question in order to cross-check and verify the results. And this is called data triangulation. So using an appropriate combination of data sources captures a more complete contextual picture of the study site. So this is what's recommended. Now to quickly recap this session, using the results of the assessment, we designed our project by first establishing a set of objectives, intended results, starting with our goal and working our way down to objectives or to activities. Then we identified external factors that could interfere with the achievement of our results. We included them in this last column to monitor throughout the project. Next, we identified strong indicators for each objective, which we will use to measure project achievement. And we considered and clarified where we will collect the data from for each indicator. So now we've completed our log frame. But we have to remember the log frame is a living document. It should be used and revised if needed throughout the life of the project cycle. During the next session, we'll be discussing the remaining key steps and deliverables that must be completed prior to beginning activity implementation in order to reach successful results-based management. And that will be session 4, Designing for Results, Part 2. Thank you.